Hello, thank you all for joining us this evening. Just a few housekeeping things. If you could all please turn your phones to silent. If you're tweeting or Instagramming, the hashtag is hashtag ADLWW. There will be a book signing at the end of the session. The bar is open until 7 and it's open till 9. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nation custodians of the land where we meet tonight, the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, present, past and emerging. Now, a special welcome to our guest, Azadeh Moaveni, who's travelled all the way from the UK to be with us here this week. Several sessions. I highly recommend you get along to them all because it's a brilliant read. It's gripping. Azadeh is a senior gender analyst for the International Crisis Group, but she spent 2 decades covering the Middle East as a reporter, working for a long list of publications, and I can't list them all, but Time Magazine, The Washington Post, the LA Times, and the New York Times are among some of the important work that Azadeh has done over the last 2 decades. And Guest House for Young Widows is actually her 3rd book. It's a gripping account of 13 young women who were recruited, inspired, or compelled to leave their lives, and in some cases their countries, to join the Islamic State. Thousands of women from across the world travelled to the promised Caliphate, and as Azadeh writes, many of these women were trying in a twisted way to achieve dignity and freedom through an embrace of a politics that ended up violating both. So it's meticulously researched over several years, so please join me in welcoming our guest this evening. Now, Azadeh, just to start, when IS began to try and capitalise and build up in early 2012, you write about the utter despair in the region at the time in the wake of the Arab Spring failing in so many countries. Tell us about that atmosphere in those days when IS first started to emerge.
Of course. Thank you. First of all, it's so good to be in conversation with you, and thank you to all of you for coming and to the festival for bringing me here. I think it's a great question to start with because I think the way that ISIS was largely theorized and covered in the media as this kind of unfathomable, evil, terrorist phenomenon that arose out of nowhere, I think for many of us who had covered the region for so long, it didn't come out of nowhere at all. It came out of very specific places, and we saw. I think especially for women to sort of be able to understand why such a violent movement could draw so many women marching across the region as we saw in 2013, 2014, as ISIS was rapidly expanding its territory, marching towards Baghdad, marching towards the cities of northern Iraq. Had it not been for the intervention of different powers, it would have taken much of Iraq. To understand that, I think we do have to go back to the Arab Spring and these uprisings country to country, which started in Tunisia, but had sort of unanimous cries in almost every country that these uprisings spread to. Young people and women were at the forefront of those movements. If you remember those hopeful images that we saw of Tahrir Square in Egypt, country to country, women were a vibrant force demanding freedom, dignity, equality, freedom. Women, I think, were very much demanding inclusion, not only in politics, but a way to improve their standing, their status in cultures that were still quite patriarchal, demanding a level of independence that I think their mothers had not demanded in previous generations. So the force of women in those protests, I think, was something that ISIS noticed. And we remember that country to country, those uprisings were either brutally repressed and replaced by regimes or orders that were even more authoritarian, descended into civil war or great repression. So to sort of understand, I think, and I opened the book with the story of a young Tunisian woman who was sort of shut out of politics before the Arab Spring and then became an activist. I think we have to see the frustrations and desires that young women had believed that those uprisings could address, and all of those pathways that women were hoping would kind of address their expectations were blocked country to country. And it was at that moment, just 2 years later, that ISIS, as it was as it was emerging, I think tapped into that in a very canny and sophisticated way, turned country to country to those same young women and directed its message. It didn't work for you there, did it? Come to us. Come to our utopian Islamic state. Join us. And all of those things you were aspiring for, seeking the equality, the freedom to practice your religion as openly as you want, you can have that here. So I think it is only really by looking back what happened before 2003 that we can start to see the sort of theater and especially the role of women in those countries that led to what we eventually saw.
And you point out how the West abandoned these young people and these women too. You've got this great term, supposedly better for women dictators, that they were left in charge and that we really turned our backs on these young people who were so desperate for change. Tell us about that, how we abandoned them.
Yeah, it's quite strange to me because every now and again one sort of reads this kind of, in hindsight, sort of disingenuous political shorthand that, we supported the Arab Spring uprisings. I don't think anyone supported the Arab Spring uprisings, but I think to sort of take it away from the abstract and to bring it into the story of some of the young women that I write about, the book opens with the story of a young woman called Noor, who was growing up in the Tunisia, the pre-Arab Spring Tunisia, and it's an important country because it's the country that kicked off the Arab Spring, of course. The spark for the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. So before 2011, Tunisia was ruled by a very, very, it's called the regime was called a secular dictatorship, but I think it largely instrumentalized religion more than it was truly secular. But Noor was a teenager in that Tunisia. And like much of Tunisian society, she grew up in a traditional and pious family, believed that once she came of adolescence, she should cover her hair. And in that Tunisia, the Tunisia of the Ben Ali regime, it was prohibited to cover your hair in a public office. You couldn't hold government work. You couldn't attend university. You couldn't go to school with a headscarf. And it's quite tremendous. I think, we were speaking earlier. I think so much of the window we get in the story of women and dress in the region is about countries that tell women what they cannot wear. But so often there's also the stories of the countries that tell women what they cannot wear when they want to cover more. And that was Noor. So she went to school one day, having watched some YouTube videos of quite conservative preachers, saying what women must do to be properly pious. And she decided that she wanted to put the headscarf and go to school. She was 13. She was being a bit rebellious, but she also thought it was the right thing in that way that teenagers who are sort of having their consciousness awakened, whether it's religious or environmental or political, are quite black and white at the beginning. So she puts it on and she goes to school and she goes into her first class and the teacher says, you can't come into the classroom wearing that, you have to take it off. And she refuses, but she persists. She goes into the second class and the teacher gets very angry at her, take that off, you cannot be in my classroom wearing this. And she again persists, and the teacher eventually attacks her. She pushes her, she tries to pull it off forcibly, and Noor is sent home. She's suspended, she drops out of school, and she just sits out life. She decided, okay, my religion matters more. And she didn't access her education. And it was sort of in a few years later, when she was a slightly older teenager, that the uprising in Tunisia kicked off. And because religion was so repressed and suppressed, there was this very febrile atmosphere in the first couple of years where there was much rebellion and much pushback against this old order that had been so corrupt, that had been so brutal in the name of religion. And Noor became sort of caught up in a movement that was quite religious. There were sides of it that were more radical. But so much of what was going on there was not so much about religion itself. It was about the right of a citizen to choose what she wears, to be able to have faith and to access opportunity in equal measure. So I think she's sort of representative of what one young woman's experience was in these old orders, and how the struggle to demand more got caught up with the crackdowns that followed.
And also, I think a universal theme of a teenage girl rebelling. And there's that example of the Bethnal Green girls. Can you remind us who the Bethnal Green girls were and how their pivot towards devout Islam and ISIS was a way of rebelling for those teenagers from a London suburb.
Of course. So those were the girls, the famous girls from East London who joined ISIS in early 2015. And maybe you all remember because they became quite iconic. Their images, the images of them walking through the airport one by one, sort of went all around the world because it was so unfathomable. How could these London-born, straight-A student,
15,
popular high schoolers, so young, how could they have taken this step, and why did no one stop them? So I followed their stories, and it was really to sort of understand better what had happened to them that I was drawn to this whole project. They were very much, again, this sort of coming of age moment in their teenage years where they were sort of becoming aware of politics. They were, they had these living room cultures. They were all from immigrant backgrounds, and I think had grown up with this kind of floating in the background that the West has colonial intentions. It intervenes and invades Muslim countries. It sort of doesn't have the best interests of Muslims at heart. It invades Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think they had this in their kind of sort of the worldview that they inherited had this. They had this challenging kind of difficulty trying to fit quite conservative Muslim parents who wanted them to be very good, pious girls, but growing up in liberal, cosmopolitan London where there was much more sort of teenage girlhood on offer. So trying to navigate this and not quite feeling like they fit at home, not quite feeling like they fit as British girls because covering your hair and wearing a headscarf and looking brown was not quite what British national identity has ever really included, that gracefully. So it was sort of this moment in their youthful kind of identities that ISIS sort of started recruiting heavily in London as well. And so when I went back to read what they were saying to each other in their Twitter exchanges and all their social media, this was part of what they were talking about is we don't really fit here. And that was something that ISIS manipulated very cleverly. No, of course you don't fit. They'll never accept you as feminist. You cover your hair. You can't be a religious feminist. Like that is an incomprehensible thing. And it plied them with these messages. So it was very much, this hybrid mix of, becoming awakened to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and, the West is nefarious and we see the West has these roles but we're living in the West and we're not of it. So all of this was sort of swirling together, and I think rebellion was very much a part of it too. I write about it sort of rebelling to the right because I think that felt, in a way, sort of safe for them. Their parents were quite religious, quite conservative, and by sort of declaring themselves in their own minds even better Muslims than their parents, their parents were the ones who were wrong. They were the ones who were on the right path. Felt like, I think, in a strange way, a safer form of rebellion. But I think that's what it was at heart as well.
And just heartbreaking reading that section of the book to see how vulnerable those girls were and how they really did feel like the world was against them. And it was really interesting reading how the British society and the British press in particular treated young Muslims there, like this fifth column, like even before ISIS existed. And the poverty in those households as well in East London. You write about that, and it just seemed like such a ripe atmosphere. And it seems, looking back now, you think, how could the counterterrorism people not have picked that up? Like, it seems so obvious, these young, really impoverished kids who were just so taken advantage of and had nowhere to turn and were made to feel like they didn't fit in.
They were certainly very vulnerable by individual stories. I mean, I think all of them came from homes in which the father was absent or the parents' relationship was quite fractious. The girl who went, we think of them as three, but there was one who was really the strong personality of the group, and she had gone first. Her mother had died of cancer. She had only grown up with her mother, and her father had just moved to the UK from Bangladesh. She didn't really know him. So she had lost her mother, the only parent she had ever really known, was grieving, spending a lot of time, going to the mosque, looking for, some sort of way to assuage her grief. And it was at that moment that she was sort of circled. And I think, the recruitment, and I think it's really important to use words like recruitment and grooming, because I think when we're talking about
15
young teenage girls, it's not dissimilar to what gangs do or what sexual predators do. They start to tell young women that they have their best interests at heart, that not to talk to your parents, don't tell your parents you're in touch with us, but we know what is good for you. And it was really shocking to me, as you say, the way that the press talked about these young women as though they were fully adults, knew what they were doing, had full agency. There was headlines, jihadi brides going off lustful, whores of the Caliphate, as though they weren't, young girls who had been groomed. And when we talk about women who were, lured to a war zone to be married off to fighters, we talk about child brides because we have a language and a set of legal delineations for when young people can have judgment. So this kind of excommunicating of them. There were columns that said, let's stop paying so much attention to these girls. Why should we try to get these girls back? Let's turn the state's attention back to our girls, because they suddenly weren't our girls anymore. And I think it was not irrelevant to this sort of kind of abandonment of them, that they were not white. They were not white British girls who could be sympathized with or protected even in quite such an obvious way.
And what was extraordinary was reading about how Shamima left, the first one, the one who really was the bossy one amongst her friends, and then nothing was really done to stop her three best friends leaving 2 weeks later. I mean, I forgot at the time, I remember them leaving, but it wasn't until I read your book that I was reminded of, wow, there was that gap. And it must have been really heartbreaking when you were interviewing their families. They always felt the authorities failed them by not giving them all the information about the first girl leaving and then having their three daughters follow. Tell us about that, because it's a really heartbreaking moment.
It was astonishing to the parents and to the families, as you say, that no one told them that their daughter's best friend had run away from home to join ISIS. So they heard that she had run away from home, but that crucial where she was running to was left out of the story. And they sent letters home, but they gave them to the girls, and the girls who were already in this kind of virgin suicides kind of solidarity pact with each other to run off after her, of course, pocketed the letters. And so this gap, and it's for the Muslim community in the UK, it was bewildering, because counterterrorism measures have really so shadowed and impinged on the space to discuss foreign policy, to talk about what extremism is. It's hard to really overstate the way that counterterrorism policies impact British Muslims. It is really a facet of everyday life. I mean, I teach university, and I'm legally mandated, if a girl in my class starts to cover her hair, I'm supposed to go have a conversation with her to make sure that she's not becoming a religious extremist. It's sort of state mandated down to everyone who has a public-facing job.
When did those laws come into power?
They've been in place at least 5 years. So it is really it is an overbearing part of one's sort of life in the UK as a Muslim. So, kind of bearing all of that into account, the community could not make sense of this lapse and began to sort of think conspiratorially. Why weren't they stopped at the airport? Not only did layers and layers of safeguarding failed. And I think that's why the suspicion that many of these counterterrorism programs and so-called de-radicalization or anti-radicalization measures are just sort of intelligence gathering sort of tactics for the community, I think really that sort of sense was intensified by this unfathomable lapse that occurred with these girls.
Not all the women who joined were children. Some of them were grown women in their 30s, and you write about the diverse range of motivations for the thousands that came from across all over the world, but particularly Europe. And 17% came from Europe to join ISIS. And some of them, what was fascinating reading their accounts was how this desperate desire to belong to something. And they all seemed to come from a bit of a broken household or a bad relationship, or they were all broken and they just wanted to belong, and how ISIS took advantage of that and gave them a sense of belonging. It was tragic.
I feel it is, and I think you have to read these stories to be able to really empathize with their individual plights. I think it's hard, and I think there's a really understandable skepticism to think, well, they were beheading aid workers on television. Everyone saw what they were doing. I mean, how could anyone kind of square this in their minds? But if the story of Lena we were talking about, she had been kidnapped from Lebanon as a child, grew up in Germany. She was stuck in a very abusive marriage, had mental health issues on her own, was very sort of apart from the world. I don't think she was really a fully functioning sort of woman in the sense that she had escaped. She was living in a shelter, kind of not doing very much at all, quite isolated, just going to the mosque. And she was eventually sort of matched up with someone. But I think it's through kind of the interiority of a life of someone who is really damaged, who's sort of cut off from family, who was so sort of socially marginalized and vulnerable that they could take such an extraordinarily idiotic, unfathomable decision simply because she wanted to get out of the life that she was in. But I think there were a lot of women and young people who knew about the violence and who were attracted to that. And I think the German young woman that I write about, Emma, is a good example of someone who was vulnerable and from a broken home. Looking for meaning somewhere, but also I think kind of attracted to the violence. I think there was some kind of fantasy about, kind of superimposing her own rebellion against German society and the parents who had neglected her, like getting all that terribly and fatally mixed up with, the Syrian people's resistance and opposition to their regime, as though if she took her own personal rebellion and imported it with her to Syria, that would be a kind of legitimate and just way for her to act out her anger.
And she was the one who, when she was in the guest house, divided the women into 3 groups. She said there were the do-gooders, the convert freshies, and the psychopaths. And I wasn't sure where she put herself, though, in that. I won't ask you to put her in a box, but I thought that was... Yeah.
She certainly thought she was a do-gooder. I got to know her very well. We had a very long and contorted 2-year relationship, mainly conducted over WhatsApp. We grew very close, and it was really only through becoming so close to her that I could sort of spot where she was justifying things to herself, or she would say something that contradicted. She was the one who, when she quite tragic in a way, because she had sort of got her boyfriend back in Germany involved in this whole thing too. He was of Turkish origin and was Muslim, and she sort of persuaded him. And so he sort of was persuaded to go to Syria, and she quite quickly decided that it wasn't for her at all, that it had been a lark but a terrible mistake, and she wanted to escape. She was also highly narcissistic, so she had these kittens that she had adopted because she was very lonely, because obviously no one in Syria spoke German or English, her 2 languages. And the kind of dynamic between these Europeans who sort of showed up and behaved in a quite overbearing colonial way with
that was
with
fascinating.
The
divisions of the women and the racism internally in a city like Raqqa, where you had all these ISIS recruits from around the world, and the local Syrians are like, those foreign girls think they're so good, they push to the front of us in the bakery, and it was fascinating the dynamics of no matter what society you have or create, caliphate, you still have those dynamics. It was amazing.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. The rivalries and the resentments and the kind of each side sort of making the case for each other. The Europeans saying, the Arabs keep all the good houses to themselves and they have the better SUVs, and we could never get such a good villa as they do, and the exact same on the other side. So Emma, was certainly part of this. I think sort of almost colonial class. I mean, she kind of reminded me of what a British civil servant must have been like, sort of in the final days of the Raj. I should have extra privileges because I'm here on some mission to save you. So she tried to escape, but she wanted to take all her luggage with her, and she wanted to take her cats. And so the guy who had been recruited to help her escape had showed up on a motorcycle, and she had all this luggage, and she had her cats. She's like, I can't leave without all of this. And he was like, goodbye. And he went off. And she even had me doing it for her. She's like, can you find someone in Istanbul who can quarantine my cats while I figure out whether the Turks are going to send me back to Germany or put me in prison? So I'm sort of looking for cat groups in Istanbul on Facebook for her. As part of the kind of, I think, as a reporter, this is a strange kind of very murky rapport and intimacy you have to build with sources to be able to figure out, are they a do-gooder or a psychopath? Which was she?
And they seem to really be able to remove themselves from the horror that was happening. Like you said, she stayed cooped up in a room just caring for these cats while Yazidi women were being kidnapped and enslaved as sex slaves. It was this bizarre double universe that a lot of these, particularly the foreign ISIS women recruits, were living. And it was really interesting to see how the young Syrian women in your book, how they didn't really distinguish between the brutality of the regime they'd been living under and then this new group, ISIS. They didn't really seem to distinguish that they were any worse, because that they had seen so much brutality. They'd heard about, rape in regime prisons and mass slaughter of families. So when ISIS started doing that, they didn't seem that repulsed by it because life had become so devalued already. Tell us about that and that different attitude from the local women who were forced to live under ISIS.
So the Syrian women that I write about, that as you say, sort of saw themselves caught up in a very bloody war in which every actor seemed equally reprehensible and equally sort of willing to crush, whoever the rival was. There were three women from Raqqa who kind of are the core kind of characters from Syria that I write. And I say characters, I mean, of course they were real people. They had grown up in Raqqa. That was their hometown that the Islamic State made its caliphate. And they were extraordinarily relatable. The first thing I wrote about any ISIS women at all was about them, because when I first met them, I thought they were so extraordinary. They were not the kind of ideological, evil kind of caricature that even I had internalized, what an ISIS woman must be like. One of them was studying English literature. The other one was studying marketing. Really wanted independent lives. They
loved Western things. They used to watch soap.
Yeah, they read Dan Brown novels, and they were on, Facebook and wanted to, travel in Europe and work in tourism. They were kind of relatable young women, like I think the young women that many of us would know. And ISIS took over their hometown. It was a civil war, and that was a side of the war that ended up taking power of where they were living. And their families ended up collaborating. And the story of the choice to collaborate, I think, is one, again, that we know. I mean, we know about France during World War II, and we know that societies who come under, fascistic regimes, people find some way to navigate survival and some way to get through that. And so they ended up collaborating too. And I think we're also very dehumanized by that, even though we see them as a perpetrator, and they were, and because not everyone chose to collaborate to the extent that they did. I mean, one of the women that I write about joined the morality police of ISIS, and she ended up having to witness one of her neighbors being lashed for not dressing appropriately. And it was a neighbor she had grown up with her whole life. They had been to each other's birthday parties, and they had broken the fast together, and they had shared the same history, and one sort of moved to this side and one moved to the other side. So they I think didn't accept, because when I was writing about them, they ended up defecting. They fled ISIS. They had married fighters. Their fighter husbands were killed. They were then pushed by ISIS to marry another fighter, which is what happened to women. And they refused. And there was pressure, and they saw that it wouldn't be tenable, that if they stayed, they would have to just kind of cyclically marry again, fighter husband dies, marry again. I mean, it was inconceivable to them to do that. So they fled. They left their families, and they fled to southern Turkey. And so when I wrote about them, and said, are you sorry for what you did and for what you participated in? They said, yes, what they did was wrong. I mean, the enslavement obviously was wrong, but everything about them was wrong. I mean, they reneged on every tenet that they said they really believed in, and they didn't seem to have, though, and I think it was something that my editors wanted me to write into the piece about them, is that they felt, that they had been crushed, that they had become monsters. I think they did simply not feel that they had extra culpability because the side that they had been attached to was ISIS. They said everyone in Syria has blood on their hands. The regime rapes women, it crushes women, it tortures women on an industrial scale. Why are we worse? Why are we worse? And I think were we discussing it the other night? I mean, I think right now everyone's quite transfixed with the humanitarian situation in Idlib, and there's much talk that, should the West intervene? Should the West not intervene? Who are the jihadists who run Idlib? They stoned a woman in 2014. They assassinate women's civil society activists. They don't let women's voice on the radio. There because of what the Syrian civil war became, there is no side that is really, I think to the perspective of many Syrians, much more culpable.
Mm-hmm. And as horrific as ISIS was and the jihadists in Idlib, and then you look at the overall death toll in Syria, and it's still 90% caused by the regime. And you think that the amount of coverage we saw of ISIS and their horrific crimes and the mass killing of Yazidis and the mass killing of people in Mosul who resisted, and yet still, when you look at those death tolls, the numbers are incredible. Compared to the coverage, I mean, did you think about that a lot when you were writing your book?
I thought about it a great deal because, part of what I wanted to sort of correct with the book was this idea of ISIS, of how it came to be. Because I think that ISIS was theorized in this monstrous way. It sucked up all of the space, as you say. It didn't give us, as journalists who were covering that conflict, a chance to be able to portray the proportionality of the scale of violence. And it didn't give us a chance to be able to, or, perhaps, this is the struggle that I've had for 20 years, and you were talking about that a little bit yesterday. How did ISIS become what it became? The Syrian civil war became a proxy war. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, these countries that are sort of deemed a bit better to be aligned with in the Middle East, that we sell so many weapons to, sent so much money to ISIS and started to cultivate the groups that grew their beards long and that were the most bigoted. And so it was sort of cultivated that way in a very kind of, to us, obvious political process. But that was not the media kind of monster that ended up being portrayed.
Yeah, there was one sentence you wrote that really stood out to me. You write that the whiff of devilry made ISIS a popular intellectual fetish in American journalistic circles, one that overlooked the contributions of American policies and wars to the group's origins. I don't think it was just American journalistic circles, but yeah, I think there were. ISIS seemed to come out of nowhere. If you didn't follow the Middle East closely, it seemed to come out of nowhere, but of course it didn't.
Exactly, and I think it became very difficult to acknowledge the degree of accountability in the history of how it had come to be, because then the mirror would be turned back to us and the countries that participated in, the political economies and kind of political security structures of the region that gave rise to this. So, I think cynically, in a way, I think many of our leaders are content. Unless that violence comes back, and so many of the conversations I have about ISIS only really care about that. How does radicalization in the West happen? How can we make sure our teenagers don't get caught up? How can we keep ourselves safe rather than, this is violence, it's a pathology that will spread out. If there is kind of patterns of politics that produce this, it will not be contained. But I think those patterns are very embedded, and it's not really easy to question them.
And they're getting very excited over there.
They're the poets.
We'll do something soon. You'll have to clap.
Fun. There was jihadi poetry too, but it wasn't very good, so we won't talk about it.
there's also a German rap star who manages to seduce a CIA agent to marry him. So that's worth a clap. We're at the point now where ISIS has been defeated and some of these women are still in these horrific camps in the north of Syria. And you just look at it and you think, that is just, if I was a counterterrorism expert sitting in Europe, it's terrifying. That the children are dying of preventable diseases in those camps. There is not enough medical care. There is an Australian citizen, actually, we just read about in The Guardian 2 weeks ago. Ben Doherty was writing about how a 3-year-old Australian girl held in Al Hol camp in Syria will likely lose her fingers to frostbite. So a child who was taken, actually born there to Australian parents who's still stuck in that camp. Tell us about how our kind of the abandonment now of these people who we want to forget and pretend never existed, how it actually risks stoking another cycle of precisely what led to ISIS in the first place.
This is the really challenging part of this whole conversation, is because ISIS is over, but there are 13,000 women and children and men who were affiliated with it, joined it, became members of it, who are still, they are not dead. They were not killed. They are still there. They exist. They're living in either detention centers and prisons or this camp. There really is a giant detention center, although it's really a giant nursery school because, most of those 13,000 are small children. And it's covered in snow. It's the bitter winter right now. And they're there because nobody wants to deal with them. They are the sort of detritus of this war that most countries, Western countries, North African countries, with the kind of strange exception of Russia and Kazakhstan, who've sort of been a bit more forward in repatriating their citizens. So essentially, they've been abandoned to this sort of detention center in the middle of northeastern Syria, and it is a very unsafe place. Unsafe in that, if you think that these are people who joined this extremist group who can plot attacks. We know that many of the attacks in Europe, the Bataclan attacks, the attacks in France, many of them were planned by these particular cells back in Syria and Iraq. So kind of leaving this kind of thousands of women and men who could at some point sort of regroup, they could escape. When I was at that camp, you could find out quite easily how much it cost to get yourself smuggled out. So it was like $1,000 for an okay smuggler, $1,500 for a good one who would probably, more reliably get you to the border. Aid workers implicated even in spiriting people out for the right price. If nothing else, if publics, and I think understandably, perhaps there is very little sympathy for these people or these women especially, on their own terms. I think the view is very much that, they're monsters, they chose this fate, leave them to their fate. Perhaps a bit of sympathy for the children, but I think even in Europe, very little. I think they're considered, they're radicalized already. They are, the terrible sort of conceptions of what a very small child, how bad a small child could be. But if nothing else, I think this political choice to sort of abandon these people because it's expedient and it's very, very popular, whether it's in Belgium or Denmark or here, I think, leave them to their, an Australian politician that I interrupted getting his coffee at a conference whose name I won't mention, I said, well, what should be done? And he was like, oh, they're evil, leave them to their fate. That's exactly what he said. I think it resonates with publics, and I think electorally, it's a very popular position to take. But I think the security people don't think it's such a good idea.
No, the long-term consequences of leaving those people there and not dealing with it and just hoping it's just going to go away. It's terrifying. What do they say to you when you meet with these counterterrorism experts? Do they have? You must talk to them in the UK. Are they horrified by their government's approach? One of the Bethnal Green girls, Shamima Begum, was, stripped of her citizenship and no acknowledgement, that, she was a child bride who was indoctrinated and now she's 19. 3 of her babies died in those conditions, and she hasn't got a country to go to. What do these security officials say to you when you meet them when they are dealing with their Boris Johnson's policies?
So usually the conversation opens with this caveat that I am not an elected official, so therefore I can say, because I think that's the kind of if there's no electoral implications, it's much easier to take the human rights compliant or even security savvy approach to this. I think there's a real weariness and a worry that it will be damaging in lots of ways, not simply the security. I mean, I think the security people are quite clear that it's difficult, but we're not talking about large numbers of people in the end. I mean, each country might have 50 or 100. And the reality is also that usually 2 to 3 times that number have already made their way home independently. So every country is dealing with its population already. They've just kind of landed. So it's not that all those systems, the social care system, the judicial system, they're already kind of kicked into gear dealing with this. So I think there's a real kind of awareness that it's largely political, that it will be damaging, and that it will be damaging to take extreme positions like citizenship stripping, which can only really be done if you're dealing with an immigrant or someone of immigrant background, because only then do they have a theoretical second nationality that they could then avail themselves of and not be rendered stateless. So this kind of policy of stripping the citizenship of someone because essentially they're seen as a second-class citizen, I think, in the eyes of people like them.
Well, yeah, Shamima Begum, they stripped her UK citizenship and said because she has legal rights to Bangladeshi citizenship, even though she's never once set foot in Bangladesh in her life.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So essentially, if you come from another place, you can be asked to go back to that other place. You become the theoretical problem of the other place and not the country that you were born to.
Many people in the audience might have seen the story on the ABC last year of an incredible Australian grandmother who tried to rescue her kids from that horrible a-hole camp. And that case is actually now under a very tight suppression order, and we can't mention any of those details or names. But, not every government has approached it the same way as the Australian government, the UK government has. And Indonesia has had an interesting approach. Tell us, what has Indonesia done with their women who went off to join ISIS?
Indonesia initially started to repatriate quite quickly. There was an Indonesian young woman that I met. Her family had escaped when Raqqa fell. There were 22 of them in a tent, and she was a millennial who had spent far too much time on the internet and had persuaded them all to go, and then felt like she had brought the wrath of God on her family by this terrible choice. But they spirited them all back. They went back, and she was put through a rehabilitation program. The men in the family went to prison, which is quite an interesting thing. Because
it was the women who took them there, but then when they went back, the men went to prison, not the women.
Country to country, the women are seen as just women, so they don't get a lot of rehabilitation help. They're not prosecuted, so in a way, they're spared to an extent. But it's really, I think, quite misguided not to think of the women as equally, not equally. Sometimes they're not as equally accountable because many of them didn't participate directly in violence. But I think getting the idea of women's participation wrong is really kind of at the root of many of these insurgencies that will continue. I mean, we have Islamic State in West Africa, in the Sahel, in Mali, in Somalia. I mean, women participate actively in all of these groups, and to not
acknowledge
map
their role,
acknowledge their role, and to sort of understand why, I think is a big gap in all this. So,
and some of there were cases in Indonesia of people who returned who then did commit attacks after returning without undergoing any of that, being reabsorbed into society, training or anything like that. They were just put back into society and committed further attacks in Surabaya, I think it was last year, yeah.
So this idea of rehabilitation is a tricky one, and it comes up a lot. Can people be de-radicalized? I think that's why most states simply tend to put men in prison, is because this idea that people can be de-radicalized, I think, is largely a Western one. I mean, I think other countries tend to criminalize and just detain men because I think it's a peculiarity of the West that this idea that there's a particular type of violence, of political violence that can be exorcised out of people's minds. But I think this is why Indonesia has stopped repatriating, though, at the same time, because I think it is seen as just too dangerous. If you are a politician and you repatriate and someone that came back on your watch commits an attack, then you may not recover from that.
And you did, at the end of the book, you also met some women in the camp who had no regrets and were the true believers. And it was really incredible how through everything that everyone had learned and what had happened, that they still clung on to that true belief and had no regrets. What was it like interviewing people like that?
Partly it was almost a relief, because that's what I thought I thought there would be more women like that, and I kept meeting women and more women, and they didn't believe, and they, had reasons, and they explained, and, kind of case to case, there was never anyone who sort of admitted, yes, I fully believe, I don't regret this. And so in a way, when I kind of arrived at a woman who did feel that way, and I think felt that way really genuinely, not because she thought she would be stabbed in the tent in the evening because she had told, Western journalists that, which I think is a fear in this camp that we've been talking about. Even then, I mean, the woman who was like that, she's I write about her in the epilogue. Even her story, even though she did have no regret, and she was like fully apocalyptic. She said, the rivers of this land will run with blood. I mean, the whole kind of apocalyptic vision, she had it. But talking to her about her story, her family's history, the kind of deep particular violence of contemporary Syrian history, the way that she came from a town that Bashar al-Assad's father had crushed 20 years ago in the 80s. A whole city razed in a day. It kind of disappeared off the map. Even though she had all of this ideological language for why she believed this, this violence had been in her family. You could sort of trace through the things she said about what happened. Like, all the men had been disappeared. They didn't even know where they were buried. They had lived this extremely brutal regime, and I think had ended up being deeply, deeply dehumanized by it, and felt it very natural to then dehumanize in response to it when given the chance. So even her, even that story, kind of tracing it back, there was some sort of, the intelligibility of seeing that someone who's deeply dehumanized, how that process then feeds their dehumanization of others, gave me a structure to understand what otherwise was just deeply horrific.
We're nearly time for questions. I've just got one last one. You recently spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and I was just intrigued to know how many people within the security apparatus in Europe are paying attention now to some of the mistakes they made, with the Bethnal Green girls and some of these people who went off. How many people are you talking to? Are you talking to some of these governments, the German government, things like that? What kind of innovative approaches are underway to make sure that this doesn't happen again when the next ISIS comes, that young, vulnerable people, aren't taken advantage of or aren't susceptible to the recruitment of an evil group like ISIS?
There's a lot of enthusiasm, I think, in policy circles for this idea that women can be peace builders. So I think there's certainly a lot of receptiveness to ways that women can now suddenly be expected to solve all these conflicts, which I think is a tricky kind of approach to take. I'm quite cynical. I think that there's a lot of feting of women peace builders and the kind of feminist foreign policy and bringing women into these complicated conversations about these insurgencies. But at core, we kind of know what drives them, and women are not going to be able to stop Boko Haram all on their own, for example, the Nigerian insurgent group. They're not going to be able to stop Al-Shabaab. And we know what will stop those groups in some way, but they those steps require deeply unattractive decisions and pressures on governments that states don't want to exert. So I think we seemingly have more inclusive conversations, and I think that can only be a good thing, to recognize that women fuel these groups. Women are part of the social base of these groups. Women are kind of political and militant actors in their own right. They're not just peace builders, and they're not just victims. So I think we're having like a much better conversation at the policy level. But I think then we hit a wall, and we hit a wall. I mean, it's International Women's Day in a few days, and it's how many years after the passing of Resolution 1325, and we have no progress with anything. And I think kind of looking at the kind of structures, the political structures that are in place that do kind of lead to or support and enable these kind of insurgencies. And I think it's all kind of knit together. We don't make progress because it's quite hard selling any defense equipment, to stop selling defense equipment to the Nigerian military that has perpetuated so much of the brutality that leads to Boko Haram. So it's easy and quite feels good to have a conversation celebrating, women peace builders. Let's have women come from Nigeria in their, colorful garb and tell us about how they're trying to bring peace. But I think it's also an unfair burden for women to be then asked to solve these insurgencies on their own.
Just before we go to questions, I just want to thank Azadeh for such a brilliant book. I highly recommend it. And just now, no, we have got questions. We do have questions. Yes, if there's a microphone in the middle there. And please, we really would appreciate questions, not statements or comments.
Thank you very much for having the courage to write a book for some people who are powerless, particularly their children. I'm wondering, given that we lose one woman at least per week at the hands of a known perpetrator of domestic abuse, why we have huge road tolls in the West, why we in the West, in contemporary society, allow fear to trump personal compassion, even to the point where we will vote in leaders of countries who will shape-shift and shift the goals in terms of citizenship. And once that door opens, it's a flood. Why do we allow fear to trump compassion?
That's a good question, and I feel that it's well directed at us as journalists. I think
sells, doesn't it, in elections? I think that's the worst bit, the worst realization. What do you think?
I think fear is very cultivated, and I think we as the media are very much complicit in that. I mean, I think fear is such a natural human impulse.
Look at the coronavirus coverage right now. I mean, yeah, fear sells newspapers, doesn't it?
It does, and I think it also is then gets invoked really easily. So we can't repatriate because the public is against it. How did the public become against anything in the first place? Because we do peddle fear. I mean, there are massive media empires that I think are built on this. So I think it's unfortunately fear becomes the necessary kind of way of preparing public sentiment for doing things that governments find expedient and profitable. So, I mean, even President Trump, who pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal for no good reason whatsoever, has sort of claimed, I'm doing this to keep the American people safe. Safe from an arms control treaty that's meant to kind of prevent, greater conflict. So even at that level of illogic, I'm pulling out of a disarmament treaty that took my diplomats 4 years to negotiate to keep you safe. I mean, I think it's potent and effective.
It's concerning that our fear of terrorism that does not seem to really take many lives in our democracy trumps our concern for children shoved in inhuman conditions in camps. I think we need to really have a close look at what we stand for. Thank you for your book.
Thank you for your question and comment. One more question? Yeah.
You were talking earlier about when you were in the camps and finding out that it was quite easy for people to sort of pay their way out. And I'm just thinking with the current issues in in Turkey with the opening up of the borders in recent days, how that might play out with those who are finding their way out.
I think what Turkey is doing in lots of places is quite worrying to a lot of people. I mean, Turkey is also sending fighters to Libya, and their real fear is that some of these jihadists or militants who were fighting, from North African countries might, spill back in with them, and might then kind of cross the border into Tunisia again. So I think there's lots of genuine security concerns about that. About the Syrian refugees, though, I mean, I think
there's 3 million civilians, isn't there? This is the problem. Syria's become such a basket case that the ISIS camp is in one part of Syria that the Kurds were in control of, and Idlib, where the current fighting is at its worst, is a different part of Syria where 3 million civilians are trapped, majority of them women and children. So it is just an absolute basket case up there at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think that it's a real struggle. But I think in Europe there's incredible and quite granular intelligence about exactly who has done what. I mean, when I spent time in Germany, for example, which took 1 million Syrian refugees, it was quite astonishing, what good intelligence the Germans had, and Germany has, largely been safe. I mean, I think there's been greater violence perpetrated against migrants and refugees in Germany than anything staged by them.
Question?
You've described Iran's late 90s movements as a brief flirtation with democracy. I'm wondering, what do you think about the American democracy, where the Republican Party is described by Chomsky as the most dangerous organization in human history, and the Democratic Party is preferring Trump over Bernie Sanders or rigging the elections? What is the democratic model that you suggest for Iran?
For Iran, a democratic model for Iran.
I spent a bit of time covering Iran in your career.
I have. I've spent a lot of time covering Iran. What does Iran need? Iran has a very flawed and fragile government at present. I think everything about Iran that we read about and we know, I think we do have to acknowledge that it has a more participatory government at present than it has had in any time in its history. And I think that's undisputable fact. At the same time, it's deeply repressive. And the elections that it has are increasingly narrow and confined to a tiny band of the population that are affiliated with the system. I think Iran, to have any kind of genuine domestic political development, needs to not exist in the permanent state of war in all but name that it is right now with the United States. I mean, Iran is under an economic embargo that we have not seen since the days of Saddam Hussein. Iran cannot export its oil. It's economically strangled. There's shortage of medicines and children are dying of leukemia. So no one in Iran right now is thinking of democracy because everyone is just trying to survive. And I think to have progress in Iran in a way that people can meaningfully begin to express their discontent again and can meaningfully participate in challenge and civil society in the way that they used to, they need to not be so focused on their immediate survival. So I think Iran's prospects very much continge on its internal development being delinked from the cycle of perpetual conflict that it has with the United States. And unfortunately, I don't think that we see that imminently, given this administration.
Are you talking about the Trump administration or Iranian ones?
The Trump administration.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think on that point we might end it. Can we all just give a big round of applause to Azadeh? Thank you so much, Azadeh.
Thank you so much.
And her fantastic book is available in the tent, and there'll be a signing just after this session. So please go check it out.